can the crime harm index be altered in any way for when dealing with law enforcement oversight, so professional standards type situations, when the investigations involve members of law enforcement?
Great. Okay, Natalie, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a tough question. There's a couple questions about the question and the fact that it doesn't exactly say which particular component. So I'm going to make some assumptions about that. And as well, when examining and analyzing offenses and under police, there's Police Services Acts, there's the criminal code. Police obviously are subject to a lot of different types of legislation and rules. So it is a very interesting question. I have never personally applied the crime harm index that way, and neither has my police service. But again, it's a great question. So in looking at here, it talks about when analyzing officer offenses, but I would say that you could also look at officer victim harm as well, because it's just like in the public, there's victimization and offending as well. The same is true within police departments in terms of officers, as we know here locally, across North America and globally, there are certain situations where officers are subject of serious scrutiny because of offending. So yes, I think that it could be altered. I have altered certain components and adapted the Canadian Crime Severity Index to look at very specific areas within offending and victimization. So I think it has the ability to withstand creativity and innovation and in altering it and applying it in different ways. Could you apply it to this type of work within law enforcement? That's a very, very big question. I know locally, if I'm looking at a Canadian circumstance or within my own jurisdiction, I don't think we have enough offending to apply it to look for patterns. But maybe if you applied it over 10 years worth of data that you would have accumulated, I don't know what your systems and processes are or what country this question is originating from, but certainly you would have to have a systematic approach to collecting the data on officers as victims and in offenders in order to pull something from it. Is it impossible? No, I don't think it is. And you may or may not have that in place already. It would be interesting to see, if you were to apply it this way, what the patterns would be in terms of offending, and maybe it would be something in looking at harm, because then you would be able to tell internally where you would have to invest your resources, maybe into police officer training, development, coaching, mentoring, performance assessments, maybe promotional criteria. So yes, I think that it could be adaptable in looking at where the harm is happening in terms of being caused and being suffered in the police landscape. But again, I think that, and help us allocate our resources and decision-making appropriately. But I think the big question is, do you have a system and a process in place that captures that data? Here, my experience is that we do not have something capturing that over the last 10 years for you to get a very clear picture and able to paint something for you to target or examine or analyze in order to prevent harm. So I think that's my answer.
Well, I'm going to ask a question of Polly, who had a Q posted in the Q&A. Whether she would like to ask it, but before she's thinking about that, I did want to add to Natalie's answer that from a U.S. perspective, I would draw people's attention to the pattern of repeated and accelerating totals of harm associated with a small number of outliers. We've discussed them in the context of rogue cops in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing, or even rogue police agencies, and the New Yorker's profile of the Vallejo, California Police Department, published recently, contains a number of repeat cases involving the same officers. as in Derek Chauvin with the George Floyd death in Minneapolis, having had 17 or 18 prior complaints. It's an interesting question of whether, if you were to apply a criminal code perspective to those priors as an investigative issue, which is what we do generally with crime harm index, whether you could in fact have a more objective way for identifying officers who might have an accelerating trajectory in terms of the kind of harm it is being alleged that they are committing illegally, or at least in violation of department rules.